Hi everyone. Today we'll be looking at what we know as the progressive era in American history, the period from the outset of the 20th century up to the time of U.S. involvement in the First World War in 1916. We can begin with an event that demonstrates the horrific continuity between the 19th century world that was being left behind and the new one that was emerging in the United States. On March 25th, 1911, a fire broke out at what was called the Triangle Shirtwaist Company. The factory occupied the top 3 floors of a 10-story building in the Greenwich Village neighborhood of New York City. Here some 500 workers, mostly young Jewish and Italian immigrant women, some of whom we see here in our first image, toiled at sewing machines, producing ladies' blouses, some earning as little as $3 per week. Those who tried to escape the blaze when it broke out that terrible day, and here we can get an idea of what it looked like from outside on the street, found that the doors to the stairwell had been locked. The owner of the factory's way was charged of discouraging theft and unauthorized bathroom breaks. The fire department rushed to the scene with high-pressure hoses, but their ladders only reached to the 6th floor. Onlookers watched in horror as young women and girls leaped from the upper stories. By the time the inferno had been put out, 46 bodies lay on the street, some of which we see in this photograph. And 100 more were found inside the gutted-out building, which we can see some of the remains of in this image. Loved ones attempted to come to the scene and claim those they'd lost, but it was not an easy task, given the severely burned state of most of the bodies. You can get an idea of it from this photograph. The Triangle Fire of 1911 focused attention on the social divisions that continued to plague American society over the first 2 decades of the 20th century, the period scholars call the progressive era. The tragedy had an enormous impact on public consciousness. In its wake, efforts to organize New York City's workers accelerated, as we can see here in this image from the time, and the state legislature passed new factory inspection laws and fire safety codes. The word progressive came into common use around 1910 as a way of describing a broad, loosely defined political movement of individuals and groups who hoped to bring about significant change in American social and political life. They included forward-looking businessmen who realized that laborers had to be accorded a voice in economic decision-making, as well as labor activists bent on empowering industrial workers. Others were members of female reform organizations who hoped to protect women and children from exploitation, along with social scientists who believed that academic research would help to solve the country's problems. And finally, many progressives were simply members of an anxious American middle class who feared that their status was threatened by the rise of big business. It's crucial to recognize, right from the start, that progressive reformers addressed issues of American freedom in varied and often contradictory ways. These years saw the expansion of political and economic freedom through the reinvigoration of the movement for women's suffrage, the use of political power to expand workers' rights, as well as efforts to improve democratic government by weakening the power of city bosses and giving ordinary citizens more influence on legislation. Yet at the same time, many progressives supported the goal of limiting the full enjoyment of freedom to those deemed, in their language, fit to exercise it properly. The new system of white supremacy, Jim Crow, born in the 1890s, became fully consolidated in the South during the period. Growing numbers of native-born whites started demanding that new immigrants abandon their traditional cultures and become fully, as the saying went, Americanized. And finally, at both the local and national levels, efforts were made to place political decision-making in the hands of experts who did not have to answer to the electorate. So even as the idea of freedom expanded, and this is the critical point, its actual boundaries contracted in what we call the Progressive Era. Cities became the focus of both progressive politics and of a new mass consumer society in the early 20th century. The United States could count 21 cities whose population exceeded 100,000 in 1910, with the largest being New York, which had a population of 4.7 million. Manhattan Island alone had over 2 million, more people than lived in 33 of the states that made up the Union. The stark urban inequalities of the 1890s continued, as we've noted, into the Progressive Era. Immigrant families in New York's downtown tenements often had no electricity or indoor toilets, while only 3 miles to the north stood the mansions of Fifth Avenue's Millionaires' Row. A new generation of journalists writing for nationally circulated magazines exposed the ills of industrial and urban life, revealing how party bosses and business leaders profited from political corruption. Theodore Roosevelt called these writers muckrakers because of their tenacity and skill at illuminating the underside of American life. Major novelists of the time as well took a similar, unsparing approach. Perhaps the period's most influential book, The Jungle, published by Upton Sinclair in 1906, who we have here in this photograph, described the unsanitary conditions of slaughterhouses in Chicago and other industrialized cities, and even the sale of rotten meat to customers. His work stirred, quite understandably, widespread public outrage, and it led directly to Congress's passage of what became known as the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act of 1906. That the measures were passed the very same year as the publication of Sinclair's expose was no coincidence. If one thing described early 20th century American cities, it was their immigrant character. The new immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe reached its peak during the Progressive Era. Between 1901 and the outbreak of World War I in Europe in 1914, some 13 million immigrants came to the United States, the majority from Italy, Russia, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Most European immigrants to the U.S. entered through Ellis Island, which we have an aerial view of here, located in New York Harbor. And in this image, we have a recently arrived group of immigrant children. In 1892, Ellis Island became the nation's main facility for processing immigrants, so that today literally millions of Americans trace their ancestry to people like the ones we see here in this photograph. At the same time, large numbers of Asian and Mexican immigrants were entering the states of the American West. After the official policy of Chinese exclusion was adopted in the late 19th century, some 72,000 Japanese arrived, primarily to work as agricultural laborers in California's fruit and vegetable fields and on Hawaii's sugar plantations. Between 1910 and 1940, what was known as Angel Island in San Francisco Bay, or the Ellis Island of the West, which we see in this aerial photo, along with one of some Japanese women arriving at the port. Angel Island served as the main entry point for almost all immigrants from Asia to the United States. Far larger than Asian immigration at the time was Mexican immigration. Between 1900 and 1930, some 1 million Mexicans, more than 10% of the country's entire population, entered the United States. By 1910, 1/7 of the American population was foreign-born. That was the highest percentage in the country's history. The new immigrants clustered in what came to be called ethnic enclaves, neighborhoods with their own shops, with their own theaters and community organizations, places where they continued to speak their native languages, like New York City's Mulberry Street, captured in this color image from around the turn of the century. Although most immigrants earn more than was possible in the impoverished regions from which they came, they still endured low wages, long hours, and dangerous working conditions. The vast majority of immigrants, no matter where they came from, remained as poorly paid agricultural, mine, and railroad laborers, or as low-wage, unskilled industrial workers, with little prospect of upward mobility. Along with their immigrant character, American cities were the birthplace of the new consumer culture. During the Progressive Era, large department stores like Sears and Roebuck and Macy's became central features of the downtown landscape, as well as smaller neighborhood chain stores. Here we have some images of the original Sears and Macy's locations in New York City from the early 20th century. And a couple more of Christmas shoppers looking at a window display. And the aftermath of holiday shopping. Who would want to be the poor guy cleaning this mess up in the image here? Coupled with the new department stores, retail mail order catalogs made available to consumers throughout the country, virtually all of the goods being produced in American factories. By 1910, people could purchase, among many other items, things like electric sewing machines, washing machines, vacuum cleaners, and record players. Leisure activities and public entertainment also took on the characteristics of mass consumption. Amusement parks, dance halls, and theaters attracted large crowds of city dwellers. Also by 1910, 25 million Americans per week, mostly working-class urban residents, attended what were called Nickelodeons, motion picture theaters like the Princess Theater in Detroit, which we have in this photo, and another much more modest one in Pittsburgh. The 5-cent admission charge, which gave these venues their name, was far lower than the cost of attending a vaudeville show, making the Nickelodeons perhaps the most popular form of public entertainment in the period. The new visibility of women in public, at work, as shoppers, and in places of entertainment like cinemas and dance halls, indicated that traditional gender roles were undergoing dramatic changes in the progressive years. As the Triangle Fire had revealed, more and more women were working for wages. Immigrant women were largely confined to low-paying factory employment. But for native-born white women, the kinds of jobs available expanded enormously. By 1920, as we get an idea from this image, around 25% of employed women were now office workers or telephone operators. Female work was also no longer confined to young unmarried white women and adult black women. Of the 8 million women working for wages in the U.S. by 1920, 1/4 were married and living with their husbands. The working woman, immigrant and native-born, working class and professional, became a symbol of female emancipation in the progressive era. If any single individual exemplified the new consumer society, it was Henry Ford, who we see in this image. Ford did not invent the automobile, but he developed the techniques of production and marketing that brought it within the reach of ordinary Americans. In 1905, he established the Ford Motor Company, at the time just one of dozens of small automobile manufacturing firms. 3 years later, he introduced the Model T, a simple, light vehicle, sturdy enough to navigate the country's poorly maintained roads. In 1913, Ford's factory in Highland Park, Michigan, adopted the method of production known as the moving assembly line, which we have an example of in this photograph. On the assembly line, car frames were brought to workers on a continuously moving conveyor belt. The process enabled Ford to expand output greatly, reducing the time that it took to produce each car. In 1914, he raised wages at his factory to the unheard-of level of $5 per day, which was more than double the pay of most industrial workers. And this allowed him to attract a steady stream of skilled laborers. When other businessmen criticized him for endangering profits by paying such high wages, Ford replied that workers had to be able to afford the goods being turned out by American factories. Ford's output rose from 34,000 cars priced at $700 each in 1910 to 730,000 Model Ts that sold at a price of $316, a figure well within the reach of many workers in 1916. The economic system based on mass production and mass consumption, not surprisingly, came to be known as Fordism. Whatever specific cause they chose to get behind, progressive reformers nearly all agreed that freedom in America needed to be infused with new meaning in order to deal with the economic and social conditions of the early 20th century. The immediate task in the progressive view was to humanize industrial capitalism and find common ground in a society still racked by labor conflict and experiencing massive immigration from abroad. In progressive America, complaints of a loss of freedom came not just from the most poorly paid factory workers, but from better off employees as well. Large firms in the automobile, electrical, steel, and other industries sought to gain greater control over the work process. Frederick W. Taylor, who we see in this photo, a so-called efficiency expert, pioneered what he described as scientific management. Through scientific study, Taylor believed, what he called the one best way of producing goods could be determined and implemented. The role of workers, he said, was to obey the detailed instructions of supervisors and managers. Many skilled workers saw in Taylor's scheme a serious erosion of their traditional influence over the work process. And they interpreted it very much as a loss of freedom, one that they'd sacrificed a great deal to achieve. Many progressives came to believe that the key to increasing industrial freedom was empowering workers to participate in economic decision-making by forming and growing stronger labor unions. Louis D. Brandeis, an active ally of the labor movement and later Supreme Court Justice, who we have an image of here, argued that unions embodied an essential principle of freedom: the right of people to govern themselves. The contradiction between political liberty and what he called industrial slavery was America's foremost social problem. Economic freedom was also the rallying cry of American socialism in the period. Socialism as a political movement reached its greatest level of influence during the Progressive Era. Founded in 1901, the American Socialist Party called for immediate reforms such as free college education, legislation to improve the condition of laborers, and as an ultimate goal, democratic control over the economy through public ownership of railroads and factories. By 1912, the Socialist Party claimed 150,000 dues-paying members in the United States. We see many of them gathering here in New York City's Union Square in this image. The party published hundreds of small-town newspapers across the country. It enjoyed substantial support within the American Federation of Labor, and even elected scores of candidates to local political offices. In the early 20th century, socialism flourished in diverse communities throughout the nation. No single individual was more important in spreading the socialist gospel or linking it to ideals of equality, self-government, and freedom than Eugene V. Debs, captured in this photograph, as usual, in front of a crowd of listeners. For 2 decades, Debs crisscrossed the country, preaching that control of the economy by a democratic government held out the only hope of uniting political equality and economic freedom for Americans. Throughout the Atlantic world of the early 20th century, socialism was a rising force. In the national election of 1912, which we'll say more about later, Debs would receive more than 900,000 votes for president, roughly 6% of the total ballots cast. Socialism, as important as it was, however, represented just one expression of the widespread discontent that plagued progressive America. In 1905, a group of union labor activists who rejected the exclusionary politics of Samuel Gompers and the American Federation of Labor, the AFL, formed their own labor organization, what became known as the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW, or just the Wobblies, as they were typically referred to. Here we see a gathering of the Wobblies, again in Union Square, New York City. Part trade union, part advocate of a workers' revolution that would seize the means of production and abolish the state, the IWW made solidarity its guiding principle. Distinguishing itself from the AFL, the organization sought to mobilize those that the AFL had excluded, including immigrant factory workers, migrant, timber, and agricultural workers, women, blacks, and Chinese on the West Coast. The Wobblies enjoyed their greatest success at a strike in Lawrence, Massachusetts, where the town's woolen mills employed 32,000 men, women, and children, representing no less than 25 different nationalities. When the Massachusetts state legislature in 1912 passed a law restricting the work week to 54 hours, employers at factories in Lawrence proceeded to cut the pay of those workers who put in the longest amount of hours, and a strike ensued, from which we have an image here. In February, the IWW convinced the Lawrence strikers to send their children out of the city for the duration of the walkout. Socialist families in New York City agreed to take them in. The public relations move proved a stroke of genius, as the sight of these children, many of whom we see in this photograph, marching up Fifth Avenue from the train station, led to a wave of public sympathy for the strikers. The governor of Massachusetts felt compelled to step in and negotiate a resolution to the crisis, remarkably, on the workers' terms. It was a notable achievement for both the immigrant laborers in Lawrence and the Wobblies. Socialism and labor radicalism both represented types of progressive reform in the era. So too did feminist ideas. It was during the progressive years that the word feminism first entered the political vocabulary of the country. Feminists' forthright attack on traditional rules of sexual behavior added a new dimension to discussions of freedom in America. Issues of intimate personal relations, previously confined to private discussion, all of a sudden seemed to blaze forth in popular magazines and public debates. For the generation of women who consciously adopted the word feminism to express their demand for greater liberty, free sexual expression, and reproductive choice emerged as critical definitions of women's emancipation. The growing presence of women in the labor market reinforced demands for access to birth control. Emma Goldman, who we see in this photo, emigrated to the United States from Lithuania when she was just 16. In the progressive years, she toured the country, lecturing on women's right to birth control and distributing pamphlets that contain detailed information about a variety of contraceptive devices. Margaret Sanger, who we see here, was one of 11 children of an Irish-American working-class family. By forthrightly challenging the laws banning contraceptive information and devices, she and Goldman placed the issue of birth control at the heart of the new feminism. In 1911, Sanger began a column on sex education, What Every Girl Should Know, that ran in a New York socialist newspaper known as The Call. By 1914, she was openly advertising birth control devices in her own journal, known as the Woman Rebel. Sanger insisted that, as she said, no woman can call herself free who does not own and control her own body, and can choose consciously whether she will or will not be a mother. In 1916, she opened a clinic in a Brooklyn working-class neighborhood where she started distributing contraceptive devices to poor Jewish and Italian women, an action for which she spent a month in prison. Progressive reformers of the time, whether they were socialists, labor organizers, or feminists, generally promoted the idea of an active, socially conscious government. The philosopher John Dewey, who we see in this image, argued that freedom was what he called a positive, not a negative concept, at the heart of which was the power to do specific things, as he said, and it sometimes required the state to act on behalf of those with little wealth or influence, those trapped at the bottom of American society. One concrete expression of this idea is captured in what we know as urban progressivism. In cities, progressives worked to reform the structure of government, to reduce the power of political bosses, to set up public control of what were called natural monopolies, things like gas and waterworks, and to improve public transportation. Urban progressives raised property taxes in order to spend more money on things like schools, parks, and other public facilities. The most influential progressive administration at the state level was that of Robert M. La Follette, who we have here in this image, sporting a magnificent head of hair quite confidently. As governor, he turned Wisconsin into a so-called laboratory for democracy. After serving as a Republican member of Congress in Washington, D.C., La Follette became convinced that an alliance of railroad and lumber companies were controlling the politics in his state. Elected governor in 1900, he instituted a series of measures that came to be known as the Wisconsin Idea. They included such things as the nomination of candidates for office through primary elections rather than appointment by political bosses, the taxation of corporate wealth, and state regulation of railroads and public utilities. The impact of urban progressivism was felt ultimately at the national level. In 1917, the 17th Amendment was passed, which provided that U.S. senators be chosen by popular vote rather than by state legislatures, that judges be elected rather than appointed in most instances, and that primary elections be held for candidates for office within the political parties. Some states, including California, went even further than Wisconsin eventually, adopting what became known as the initiative and referendum to allow citizens to propose and vote on legislation, and the recall to remove politicians from office by popular vote. It is quite easy to applaud the progressive reformers of these years for the many ways in which they were expanding definitions of freedom, from socialism and labor radicalism to feminism and urban activism. But it is just as crucial, in fact imperative, to understand the limits of progressives' vision as well. The era witnessed numerous restrictions on democratic participation, most strikingly, of course, in the case of black disfranchisement in the South, but also in the example of things like the literacy tests, residency, and registration requirements that limited the rights of poor people generally to vote. For progressives who emphasize the so-called fitness of voters, the functioning of American democracy did not require their participation. Still, it was alongside this mainstream progressive vision that was very much in line with the racism, nativism, and exclusionary impulses of the time that a smaller but gradually more and more significant strain of progressivism, more democratic, more inclusive, emerged. Organized female reformers, probably more than any other group, spoke for this more democratic side of progressivism. Still barred from voting and holding office in most states, women nonetheless became central to the history of the period. The immediate catalyst was a growing awareness among women reformers of the plight of poor immigrant communities. Also of major concern was the condition of female and especially child laborers. The era's most prominent female activist and reformer was Jane Addams, who we can see in this image. Born in 1860, she was the daughter of an Illinois businessman. In 1889, she founded what was known as Hull House in Chicago, which we have a photograph of here. It was a settlement house, as such organizations came to be known, devoted to improving the lives of the immigrant poor in the nation's cities. Unlike previous reformers who had aided the poor from afar, settlement house workers like Adams moved into poor neighborhoods. They built kindergartens and playgrounds for children, set up employment bureaus and health clinics, and showed female victims of domestic abuse how to gain legal protection. By 1910, more than 400 settlement houses had been created in cities across the country. Adams was typical of the Progressive era's new woman. By 1900, there were more than 80,000 college-educated women in the United States. Many, like Adams, found a calling in providing social services, while others looked to nursing and providing education to poor families in the country's largest cities. The efforts of middle-class women to uplift the poor and of laboring women to uplift themselves helped ultimately to shift the center of gravity of politics toward a more activist government in America. Women such as Adams discovered that even well-organized social work was not enough to alleviate the problems of inadequate housing, income, and health. Government action was essential. Hull House instigated an array of reforms in Chicago that were soon adopted elsewhere, including things like stronger building and sanitation codes, shorter working hours, and safer labor conditions, as well as the right of labor to organize. The momentum female reformers generated in the progressive years turned the drive for woman suffrage into a truly mass movement. Membership in the National Woman Suffrage Association grew from just 13,000 members in 1893 to more than 2 million by 1917. Here in this image we have some suffragettes from the period. By 1900, more than half the states allowed women to vote in local elections dealing with public school issues. And Wyoming, Colorado, Idaho, and Utah had adopted full woman suffrage. Between 1910 and 1914, 7 more Western states enfranchised women. In 1913, Illinois became the first state east of the Mississippi River to allow women to vote in presidential elections. All of these campaigns, which brought women aggressively into the public sphere of American life, were conducted with a new spirit of militancy. They also made effective use of the techniques of modern advertising, publicity, and mass entertainment that characterized the U.S. as an emerging mass consumer society. California's successful 1911 campaign, for example, utilized automobile parades, numerous billboards and electric signs, and countless suffrage buttons and badges. The problem was that state campaigns were difficult, extremely expensive, and did not always lead to a victorious result. Increasingly, because of this, the movement focused its attention on securing a national constitutional amendment giving women the right to vote. Perhaps, ironically, it was a desire to exalt women's role within the home that did much to inspire the reinvigoration of the suffrage movement in the late 19th and early 20th century. Beyond the fight for the vote, female reformers in the progressive era helped to launch a mass movement for direct government action to improve the living standards of poor mothers and children. Laws providing for what were called mothers' pensions, state aid to mothers of young children who lacked male support, spread rapidly after 1910. These maternalist reforms, as they were known, rested on the assumption that the government should encourage women's capacity for bearing and raising children, and that it should empower them to be economically independent. Other progressive era legislation, while recognizing that larger and larger numbers of women were working outside the home, defined them under law as a dependent group, like children, who were in need of state protection in ways that male workers were not. In 1908, in the landmark Supreme Court case Muller v. Oregon, Louis D. Brandeis filed a famous brief that cited scientific and sociological studies to demonstrate that because they had less strength and endurance than men, long hours of labor were dangerous for women. At the same time, their unique ability to bear children gave the government a legitimate interest in women's working conditions. Persuaded by Brandeis's argument, the Supreme Court unanimously upheld the constitutionality of an Oregon law that set maximum working hours for women. The cost of the ruling proved high. At the very time that women were entering the labor market and earning college degrees in unprecedented numbers, Brandeis's brief and the court's opinion worked to solidify a popular view of women workers as weak, dependent, and incapable of enjoying the same economic rights as men. By 1917, 30 states had enacted laws limiting the hours of female workers. Progressive reformers, whatever their particular cause, came to believe that poverty, economic insecurity, and the lack of industrial democracy and freedom were national problems that required, in fact demanded, national solutions. In the New Republic, the editor, Herbert Croly, offered an alternative to control of Americans' lives by narrow interests and the all-powerful corporations that manipulated the country's politics. He argued that in order to achieve democratic self-determination and individual freedom, the nation needed to employ government intervention in the economy. All of the progressive-era presidents, Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson, in their own way, attempted to follow such a course. In September 1901, the anarchist Leon Czolgosz assassinated William McKinley while he was visiting the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York. This made Theodore Roosevelt, who we have in this image, at the age of 42, the youngest man ever to hold the office of president. Roosevelt called his domestic program for the country the Square Deal. He attempted to distinguish between what he termed good and bad corporations when it came to confronting the problems caused by economic consolidation. Corporations like U.S. Steel and Standard Oil were deemed good entities because, as Roosevelt claimed, they served the public interest. Those operations defined as bad businesses by the administration were those, as the president said, being run by greedy financiers that were only interested in their own profits. Such companies, it was argued, had no right to exist. Shortly after coming into office, Roosevelt shocked the corporate world when he announced his intention to prosecute what was called the Northern Securities Company, owned by J.P. Morgan, under the Sherman Antitrust Act. Morgan's holding company controlled the stocks and directed the affairs of three major Western railroads that monopolized transportation between the Great Lakes region and the Pacific Northwest. In 1904, the Supreme Court ordered Northern Securities dissolved. It was a major victory for the Roosevelt administration and the antitrust movement. In Roosevelt's second term, the first and only one to which he was popularly elected, he proposed strengthening the Interstate Commerce Commission, and in 1906, Congress passed what was known as the Hepburn Act, which gave the ICC the power to examine railroads' business records and to set reasonable rates for the transportation of goods, a significant step, in other words, toward federal intervention in the corporate economy. Roosevelt's perhaps best known, however, for his identification with the conservation movement of the period. If the United States lagged behind Europe in many areas of social policy, it actually led the way when it came to the conservation of natural resources. As more and more Americans moved to cities, they started to see nature less as something to be conquered and more as a place for recreation and personal growth. Under Roosevelt, conservation became federal policy. He ordered that millions of acres be set aside as wildlife preserves, and he encouraged Congress to create a string of new national parks. In 1908, Roosevelt's chosen successor to the presidency, William Howard Taft, who we have in this image here, entered the White House. Clearly the most rotund president we've had, Taft ended up pursuing antitrust prosecutions even more aggressively than Roosevelt had. He persuaded the Supreme Court in 1911 to declare John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company in violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act and to order its breakup into separate marketing, producing, and refining companies. Taft also supported the 16th Amendment to the Constitution, which authorized Congress to enact a graduated income tax. It was ratified shortly before he left office in 1912. Despite these achievements, as we've mentioned, Taft gravitated toward the more conservative as opposed to the progressive wing of the Republican Party. And midway through his term, he had a rift with progressives over Roosevelt's environmental policy that led directly to his downfall. In 1910, Taft fired Gifford Pinchot as Secretary of the Interior. This was Roosevelt's greatest ally and advisor in the movement for conservation. Taft intended to return some of the land protected by the Roosevelt administration to the public domain, where it would become accessible to lumber and mining companies. In response, Roosevelt decided to run for president again, challenging Taft, first for the Republican nomination, and after failing in that endeavor, launching an independent campaign for the White House as head of the new Progressive Party in 1912. All the different elements of progressive era thinking came together in the presidential campaign in 1912. The four-way contest between the sitting executive, Taft, Roosevelt, the Democratic nominee, Woodrow Wilson, and the Socialist Party's Eugene V. Debs became nothing less than a national debate on the relationship between political and economic freedom in the age of big business. At one end of the political spectrum stood Taft, who stressed that economic individualism could remain the foundation of the social order, so long as government and private entrepreneurs cooperated in addressing the nation's social problems. At the other end was Debs. Relatively few Americans supported the Socialist Party's goal of abolishing the so-called capitalistic system altogether, but its immediate demands, including public ownership of the railroads and banking system, government aid to the unemployed, and laws establishing shorter working hours and a minimum wage, truly summarized forward-thinking progressive thought. But in 1912, it was the battle between Roosevelt and Wilson over the federal government's role in securing economic freedom for people that drew most of the public's attention. The two candidates represented competing strands of progressivism. Both believed government action necessary to preserve individual freedom, but they differed over the dangers of increasing the government's power and the inevitability of economic concentration. Wilson insisted that democracy could be reinvigorated by restoring market competition and freeing the government from domination by big business. Wilson feared big government as much as he feared the power of the corporations. The New Freedom, as he called his program, envisioned the federal government strengthening antitrust laws, protecting the right of workers to unionize, and actively encouraging small businesses, creating, in other words, the conditions for the renewal of economic competition without increasing government regulation of the economy. To Teddy Roosevelt's supporters, Wilson seemed like a relic of a bygone era, and they insisted that his program, while it served the needs of small businessmen, completely ignored the inevitability of economic concentration, as well as the interests of professionals, consumers, and wage workers. Espousing his own plan, what he called the New Nationalism, Roosevelt argued that only the controlling and directing power of the government could restore liberty to the oppressed. He wanted heavy taxes on personal and corporate fortunes and called for the federal regulation of industries, including railroads, mining, and oil. The Progressive Party platform of 1912 offered numerous proposals to promote social justice. Drafted by a group of settlement house activists, labor reformers, and social scientists, the platform laid out a blueprint for a modern, democratic welfare state, complete with women's suffrage, federal supervision of corporate enterprise, national labor and health legislation for women and children, an 8-hour day and so-called living wage for workers, and a national system of social insurance covering unemployment, medical care, and even old age. Roosevelt's Progressive Party campaign helped to give freedom a modern social and economic substance, establishing, frankly, an agenda that would define political liberalism for much of the 20th century. The Republican split, however, between Taft and Roosevelt guaranteed that Woodrow Wilson, who we see in this image, the Democrat, would become the next president. He took 42% of the popular vote and more than enough electoral votes to secure the victory. Roosevelt did manage to accomplish one of his chief aims in 1912 by coming in second. He succeeded in humiliating Taft and denying him a second term. Roosevelt garnered 27 to Taft's 23% of the popular vote, with Debs coming in last and garnering roughly 6% of the votes cast. In office, Woodrow Wilson proved to be a strong executive. He became the first president to hold regular press conferences, the first to deliver his annual messages personally before Congress, as opposed to just sending a written message, as all previous executives had. With Democrats in control of Congress, Wilson moved aggressively to implement his version of progressivism. To this end, he presided over the creation of two powerful new public agencies. In 1913, Congress set up the Federal Reserve System, consisting of 12 regional banks. They would be overseen by a central board appointed by the president and empowered to handle things like the issuance of currency, aiding banks in danger of failing, and influencing interest rates with the goal of promoting economic growth. A second expansion of federal power occurred the next year, in 1914, when Congress established the Federal Trade Commission, or FTC, to investigate and prohibit unfair business activities, such as price fixing and monopolistic practices. Both the Federal Reserve and the FTC were welcomed by many business leaders, not simply because they wanted to restore order to the economic marketplace, but more pointedly because they hoped to stave off more radical measures designed to curb or even eradicate corporate power and influence. Both agencies represented a remarkable expansion of the federal government's role in the economy. By the year 1916, the social ferment and political mobilizations of the progressive era had effectively given birth to a new American state. But a storm was already engulfing Europe, one that would severely test the progressive faith in empowered government as the protector of American freedom. This, of course, was what Europeans call the Great War, and what we more commonly know as the First World War, or just World War I. That's where we'll pick things up next time.